The moment I saw Patricia from the HOA standing at my door with that clipboard and her signature tight-lipped smile, I knew my peaceful Tuesday afternoon was about to go sideways. I'm Brandt, and I own a small HVAC business in Prescott, Arizona. After 15 years working for corporate giants, I finally went solo 3 years ago, and life had been pretty good. My truck stayed busy, my reputation was solid, and most importantly, I got to pick my clients. That last part would become crucial about 5 minutes into this conversation. Mr. Brandt, I'm Patricia Hendricks, president of the Whispering Pines HOA board, she announced, not waiting for me to invite her in. She just walked past me into my living room like she owned the place. I'm here because we have an urgent matter regarding community services. I closed the door slowly, already feeling my jaw tighten. I'd bought my house in Whispering Pines 2 years ago, and while the neighborhood was nice enough, the HOA had been a constant thorn in my side. Last month they'd fined me for having my work truck parked in my driveway overnight. The month before that, they'd measured my grass and claimed it was 1/4 inch too long. I'd paid the fines because fighting them seemed like more trouble than it was worth, but my patience was wearing thin. "What can I do for you, Mrs. Hendricks?" I asked, remaining standing even though she'd already seated herself on my couch. She pulled out a stack of papers from her leather folder. The HOA Community Center has been without proper heating for 3 weeks now. Our regular contractor backed out, claiming we were too difficult to work with, which is absolutely absurd. We have our monthly meeting this Saturday, and temperatures are supposed to drop to the low 40s. We need someone to install a temporary heating solution by Friday afternoon. I crossed my arms. That's 4 days from now, and you're just asking me today. We've been trying to find someone, she said curtly. Everyone else in town is apparently too busy or not interested. You live in the community, so you have a vested interest in keeping our facilities operational. There it was. The entitled assumption that because I lived here, I owed them my services. I'd heard through the grapevine that the HOA had burned through 3 different contractors in the past year alone, all because Patricia and her board members treated vendors like servants. "My schedule is pretty full," I said carefully, "but I might be able to fit you in. My emergency rate for rush jobs is $300 per hour, plus materials and equipment rental at market rate plus 30%. Patricia's face went red. $300. That's highway robbery. Our previous contractor charged $85 per hour. "And where is your previous contractor now?" I asked. She stood up, clutching her folder. "This is extortion. You're taking advantage of the HOA's situation." I shrugged. "Those are my rates for rush emergency work." "You've got 4 days to prepare for a meeting you've known about for months. Poor planning on your part doesn't constitute an emergency on mine. If you want me to drop everything and work on your community center, that's what it costs." "The HOA board will hear about this," she snapped, heading toward the door. "I'm sure they will," I replied, opening it for her. "You've got my number if you change your mind." She stormed out, and I figured that was the end of it. I'd basically priced myself out of the job on purpose. The last thing I needed was to get entangled with the HOA on a professional level when they were already making my personal life difficult. Wednesday came and went. I serviced 2 residential units in Prescott Valley and did a maintenance check on a restaurant's walk-in freezer. Thursday morning, I was under a house in Chino Valley, replacing corroded ductwork when my phone rang. "Brandt," I answered, holding the phone between my shoulder and ear while I marked measurements. "Mr. Brandt, this is Linda from the Whispering Pines HOA board. I understand you spoke with Patricia about heating our community center." Linda Martinez was the HOA secretary, a slightly more reasonable person than Patricia, though that wasn't saying much. She'd been the one who approved my appeal on the grass-length fine last year. "That's right," I said. "We'd like to accept your proposal. The board voted this morning and we're prepared to pay your rates." I almost dropped my phone. $300 per hour plus materials and rental fees. "Yes, we need this done by tomorrow afternoon. Can you commit to that timeline?" Part of me wanted to say no just on principle, but $300 an hour was $300 an hour. And if they were desperate enough to pay it, maybe they'd finally learn a lesson about treating contractors with respect. "I'll need a signed contract and a 50% deposit up front," I said. "Non-refundable, regardless of completion. If I'm clearing my schedule, I need that guarantee." There was a pause. "How much are we talking?" I did quick mental math. The community center was about 3,000 square feet. For a temporary heating solution that would work reliably, I'd need to bring in several industrial propane heaters, run proper ventilation, and ensure all safety protocols were met. The equipment rental alone would be significant, and I'd need at least 8 hours of work, probably more like 10. Estimate is $3,500 total, including everything, so I need $1,750 upfront. Another pause. "I'll have to call an emergency board meeting. Can you give me until this afternoon?" "Sure, but I'll need that deposit in my account before I order any equipment." By 3 p.m., I had a signed contract in my email and a bank transfer confirmation. $1,750, just like that. I stared at my computer screen in my home office, shaking my head. They were actually doing this. I called my equipment supplier in Phoenix. "Hey Marcus, it's Derek. I need 3 industrial propane heaters delivered to Prescott by tomorrow morning. The big ones, rated for commercial spaces." "Tomorrow morning." "Derek, you know that's rush delivery." "I know. What's it going to cost me?" $150 for the rush fee, plus your usual rental rate. 3 units for 2 days, that's $900 total with the fee. "Do it. I'll send you the delivery address." I spent the rest of Thursday afternoon getting everything lined up. I called my insurance company to add the community center to my liability coverage for the job. I ordered the propane tanks from a local supplier who could deliver Friday morning. I triple-checked the square footage of the community center using the county records online. Everything had to be perfect because I knew Patricia would be watching for any excuse to cause problems. Friday morning arrived cold and gray. I was at the community center by 7 a.m., even though my equipment wasn't scheduled to arrive until 8. The building was a standard prefab metal structure, painted to look like it belonged in the neighborhood but basically just a glorified shed. It sat at the back of the Whispering Pines development, surrounded by a small parking lot and some decorative rocks that passed for landscaping. I used my own key to get in. As a homeowner in the community, I technically had access, though I'd never used it before. Inside was a large open room with folding chairs stacked against one wall, a small kitchen area, and a bathroom. The heating system was ancient, and I could immediately see why it had failed. Someone had tried to cheap out on repairs years ago, and the whole unit was essentially shot. The equipment arrived at 8:15, and I spent the next 2 hours setting everything up. The propane heaters were industrial-grade units, each capable of heating 1,000 square feet efficiently. I positioned them strategically around the room, ensuring even heat distribution. Then came the crucial part: ventilation. Propane heaters produce carbon monoxide, so I had to set up proper airflow and bring in CO detectors to ensure safety. By noon, I was testing the system. The heaters roared to life, and within 20 minutes, the temperature in the building had risen from 48 degrees to a comfortable 72. Perfect. I was finishing up my safety checks when Patricia walked in with two other board members I recognized. One was George Hendricks, her husband and the board treasurer. The other was Brenda Walsh, who handled architectural compliance, which meant she was the one who'd originally fined me for my truck. "Is it done?" Patricia asked, not even greeting me. "Just finished," I replied, wiping my hands on a rag. "The system is operational. I've set the thermostats to maintain 70 degrees. You've got enough propane for about 48 hours of continuous operation at this temperature. After that, you'll need to refill or find a permanent solution." George walked around the room examining the heaters with a suspicious eye. "These seem excessive. Do we really need 3 of them? For this square footage and with the insulation in this building, yes. You wanted it heated properly and safely. That's what you've got." Brenda was looking at the paperwork I'd left on one of the folding tables. "The bill is $4,100. We estimated $3,500. The rental company charged a rush fee I hadn't initially calculated. Everything is itemized. Plus, I ended up needing 10 hours instead of 8. All within the terms of the contract." Patricia snatched the paperwork. "This is outrageous. You took advantage of us." I packed up my tools slowly, keeping my voice level. "You agreed to my rates. Everything is documented and within the contract you signed. The system works, it's safe, and it'll keep your meeting warm tomorrow. If you have an issue with the bill, you can take it up with your lawyer, but I fulfilled my end of the agreement." "The HOA will be reviewing this," George said stiffly. "You do that." I picked up my toolbox and headed for the door. "Oh, and you'll need to refill the propane by Sunday evening if you want heat beyond that. I've left the supplier's number on the paperwork." I walked out into the cold afternoon air, loaded my truck, and drove home. The remaining $2,300 was transferred to my account that evening without any further communication. Apparently, despite all the complaining, they had no actual grounds to dispute the charges. Saturday came, and I deliberately stayed away from my house during the HOA meeting. I drove up to Sedona and spent the day hiking, letting the red rocks and clear air wash away the stress of dealing with Patricia and her crew. My phone stayed silent, which I took as a good sign. Sunday morning, I was having coffee on my back patio when my doorbell rang. Through the window, I could see it was Patricia again, and she wasn't alone. Linda was with her, along with George and 2 other people I didn't recognize. I opened the door but didn't invite them in. "Can I help you?" Patricia looked like she'd been chewing nails. Her face was pinched, and she was gripping her ever-present folder so tightly her knuckles were white. "We need to discuss your services yesterday. The bill has been paid in full. There's nothing to discuss." "The heating system failed last night," George interjected. The meeting ran until 8 p.m., and by the time we locked up, the building was barely 60 degrees. I frowned. "Did you check the propane levels?" "Why would we need to check anything?" Patricia snapped. "You installed the system. It's your responsibility to ensure it works." The system was working perfectly when I left Friday afternoon. "How long did you run the heaters?" Linda pulled out her phone, checking notes. "We turned them on at noon yesterday for the meeting. The meeting started at 2 and ended at 8. "So 8 hours of operation," I said. "And what was the outside temperature?" "It dropped to 38 degrees last night," one of the people I didn't recognize said. He was a thin man in his 60s wearing an expensive-looking jacket. "I'm Harold Peterson, board member. The point is, your heating system was inadequate." I held up a hand. "Let me get this straight. You ran 3 industrial heaters for 8 hours in near-freezing conditions, and you're surprised the propane started running low." "You said we had 48 hours, Brenda said accusingly. 48 hours at 70 degrees with outside temperatures in the mid-40s. which was the forecast when I installed the system. It got much colder than predicted, and you ran them longer than a typical meeting. That increases fuel consumption significantly. Patricia stepped closer. This is unacceptable. You will refund the full amount. No, I won't. I fulfilled the contract exactly as specified. I provided a heating system that worked for your Saturday meeting, which it did. What you did after that and how the weather changed isn't my responsibility. This is fraud, George said. We're going to file a complaint with the State Contractors Board. I pulled out my phone. Please do. I have photos of the installation, documentation of the weather forecast at the time of installation, and a signed contract that specifies exactly what I was responsible for. I also have temperature logs from the sensors I left in the building showing the system maintained 70 degrees consistently during the time frame I guaranteed. You left sensors? Linda asked. Standard practice. They're still in there, sending data to my phone. Would you like to see the readout? Shows perfect temperature maintenance from Friday afternoon through Saturday at 8 p.m., exactly when you said the meeting ended. That took some of the wind out of their sails. Patricia's face went from red to purple, but she seemed to realize she didn't have a legal leg to stand on. This isn't over, she finally said. The HOA board will be discussing your conduct. Discuss away, I replied. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have actual paying customers to attend to. I closed the door and watched through the window as they retreated to the sidewalk, clustering together for an angry discussion. Linda seemed to be trying to calm Patricia down while George was on his phone, probably calling a lawyer who would tell him exactly what I just explained. Monday morning brought a certified letter from the HOA's attorney. I opened it at my kitchen table, already knowing what it would say. Sure enough, it was a demand letter claiming breach of contract and demanding a full refund plus damages for emotional distress and inconvenience. I called my own lawyer, Sam Morrison, who had kept on retainer for exactly this kind of situation. Sam worked out of a small office in downtown Prescott and specialized in small business disputes. They're bluffing, Sam said after I read him the letter. You've got documentation, a signed contract, and evidence the system worked as specified, plus emotional distress. Over a temporary heating system, no judge is going to award that. So I just ignore it. I'll draft a response. Basically, we'll tell them to pound sand in legal terms. If they want to pursue this, they'll have to file an actual lawsuit, which will cost them way more in legal fees than they'd ever recover. My guess is their lawyer is just doing what they paid him to do, sending a scary letter. Sam was right. 2 weeks later, I received another letter from the HOA's attorney, this time withdrawing the demand and stating they were pursuing other remedies. That was lawyer speak for "we've got nothing, but we're too proud to admit it." But Patricia wasn't done with me, not by a long shot. In early December, I got another fine from the HOA. This time, it was for unauthorized commercial activity in a residential zone. They were claiming that because I ran my HVAC business from my home office and parked my work truck in my driveway, I was violating the HOA covenants. I read through the covenant documents, all 87 pages of them, and found nothing that explicitly prohibited home-based businesses or commercial vehicles. The covenant did have a clause about nuisance activities, but it was vague and clearly meant for things like running an auto repair shop with customers coming and going at all hours. I appealed the fine through the HOA's formal process, submitting a 10-page response with citations to the actual covenant language and Arizona state law, which protected certain home-based businesses. The appeal was denied within 24 hours. No explanation, Just a form letter saying the board had reviewed my appeal and determined the fine was valid. The fine was $500, due within 30 days. I paid it, but I also started documenting everything. Every interaction with the HOA, every fine, every piece of mail. I set up a folder on my computer and started scanning everything. I had a feeling this was going to escalate. January brought 3 more fines in quick succession. First, my trash cans were allegedly visible from the street for more than 12 hours after pickup. The photo they sent showed my cans at the curb at 7 a.m. on trash day. Pickup was at 6 a.m., so technically they'd been there for 25 hours, but only because I'd been on a job in Flagstaff and couldn't get home until evening. That was $250. Second, my house numbers weren't the approved size according to recent updates to the community standards. The numbers had been there when I bought the house, approved by the previous owner, but apparently the HOA had changed the requirements. New numbers had to be 4 inches tall instead of 3 inches. Another $250, plus the cost of new numbers. Third, and this one really got me, I was fined for excessive noise because I'd been running a compressor in my garage at 8 p.m. on a Saturday. A neighbor had complained. The fine was $500. I was hemorrhaging money to these people, and it was crystal clear this was retaliation for the heating bill. Patricia was using her position to punish me for charging what she considered too much. That's when I decided to fight back. Arizona has specific laws about HOA conduct, and one of them prohibits targeted harassment of homeowners. I started gathering evidence of similar situations in the neighborhood. I talked to other homeowners who'd had run-ins with Patricia's board. What I discovered was enlightening and disturbing. Marcus and Julie Brenner, 2 streets over, had been fined repeatedly for their children's play equipment, even though multiple other houses had similar setups with no fines. The Brenners had challenged Patricia about something during a meeting, and suddenly, they were getting monthly citations. Tom Richardson on Maple Drive had been fined for his rose bushes being the wrong color. They were pink instead of red, apparently a violation of the landscaping guidelines that nobody else was being held to. Tom had voted against a special assessment Patricia had pushed through, and the fines started immediately after. There were others. At least 6 families who'd crossed Patricia in some way and were now drowning in petty fines and violations. The pattern was clear and, more importantly, documentable. I called Sam again. "I think we have a case for harassment and abuse of power." "Tell me everything," Sam said, and I did. By the end of February, Sam had prepared a comprehensive filing. We weren't just fighting my fines. We were going after the entire board for systematic harassment and violation of Arizona HOA statutes. We had declarations from 8 homeowners, hundreds of pages of documentation, and a clear pattern of retaliatory conduct. The lawsuit was filed in Yavapai County Superior Court on March 1st. We sued Patricia personally, along with George, Brenda, and Harold. We also sued the HOA itself for failing to properly oversee its board members. The local newspaper, the Prescott Valley Tribune, got wind of it. A reporter named Jennifer Slate called me for an interview. "Mr. Brandt, what prompted you to take legal action against your HOA?" I chose my words carefully. "This isn't about any one fine or any single incident. It's about a pattern of abuse and harassment by board members who are using their positions to settle personal grudges. Homeowners in Whispering Pines are being targeted for retaliation if they dare to disagree with the board, or in my case, charge market rates for professional services." The story ran on page 3 of the local section. It wasn't huge, but it was enough. Within days, I was getting calls from other Whispering Pines residents, some offering support, others sharing their own horror stories about Patricia's board. The HOA's response was swift and predictable. They sent a letter to all residents claiming I was a disgruntled homeowner trying to avoid legitimate fines, and that my lawsuit was frivolous and would be dismissed. They called an emergency HOA meeting to discuss the situation. I attended that meeting with Sam by my side. The community center was packed. Must have been 70 or 80 people crammed into that space, which ironically was being heated by the same propane system I'd installed months earlier. Apparently, they still hadn't fixed the permanent heating system. Patricia called the meeting to order, her voice sharp and authoritative. We're here to address the malicious lawsuit filed by Brandt and to reassure homeowners that the board is acting in everyone's best interests. I raised my hand. Point of order. I'm here and would like to speak. You'll get your turn, Patricia snapped. Actually, Sam stood up. Under Arizona HOA regulations and your own bylaws, any homeowner has the right to address the board during the open forum portion of any meeting. You need to allow Mr. Brandt to speak. Patricia looked at George, who whispered something to her. She nodded stiffly. Fine, 5 minutes. I stood, and suddenly all those eyes were on me. I'd never been great at public speaking, but anger is a powerful motivator. I'm not here to argue about my fines specifically, I began. I'm here because this board, led by Patricia Hendricks, has been systematically abusing its power to punish homeowners who don't fall in line. I've spoken with dozens of residents who have experienced the same pattern. You disagree with the board, you vote against something they want, or you refuse to give them preferential treatment, and suddenly you're drowning in fines for violations that nobody else gets cited for. That's a lie, Brenda shouted from the board table. Is it? I pulled out a folder. Marcus and Julie Brenner have been fined 6 times in the past year for their children's play equipment. Meanwhile, there are 4 other houses within 2 blocks that have identical or larger play sets with 0 fines. The only difference. The Brenners challenged a board decision about guest parking. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. I continued. Tom Richardson has been fighting fines about his landscaping for months, even though his yard is actually more compliant with the guidelines than most. But he voted against a special assessment, and now he's a target. I've got documentation on 8 families who show the exact same pattern. This isn't about community standards. This is about retaliation and abuse of power. Patricia stood up, her face flushed. You have no proof of any targeting. Every fine issued has been legitimate and based on actual violations. Then explain why you've never fined the house on Cedar Lane that has a commercial van parked in the driveway 24/7, but you fine me for having my truck there overnight. Explain why the Johnsons have had their trash cans visible for days at a time with no citations, but I got hit with a $250 fine for 25 hours. The evidence shows selective enforcement, and selective enforcement based on personal grudges is illegal in Arizona. Sam stepped up beside me. The lawsuit includes detailed documentation of every fine issued by this board in the past 2 years. We've cross-referenced them with similar situations that received no fines. The pattern is undeniable. Unless this board can provide legitimate justification for the disparate treatment, they're looking at serious legal consequences. The meeting devolved into chaos after that. Homeowners started shouting questions at the board. Several people stood up to share their own stories of suspicious fines. Patricia tried to maintain control, but it was clear she'd lost the room. Finally, Linda stood up. She looked pale and shaken. I think the board needs to take a recess and discuss this situation. They retreated to a back office, and the community center erupted in conversation. People clustered around me, asking questions, sharing stories. The consensus was clear. Patricia had made herself a lot of enemies, and they were ready to see her taken down. When the board returned 20 minutes later, George was the one who spoke. After discussion, the board has decided to place all disputed fines on hold pending an independent review of our enforcement procedures. We'll be hiring an outside management company to audit our practices and ensure fairness. It wasn't a full victory, but it was a start. Sam leaned over and whispered, "That's lawyer speak, for they know they're in trouble." Over the next 2 months, things moved slowly but steadily in our favor. The management company they hired, a professional HOA management firm out of Phoenix called Summit Community Solutions, started their audit in April. By May, they'd issued a preliminary report that basically confirmed everything we'd been saying. Selective enforcement, lack of documentation, inconsistent application of rules, and evidence of personal bias in decision-making. The report was damning. It recommended that the entire board resign and that new elections be held under supervised conditions. It also recommended reversing dozens of fines, including all of mine. Patricia fought it, of course. She called another emergency meeting and tried to discredit the management company, claiming they were biased and had been influenced by my lawsuit. But the evidence was too clear. Even her allies on the board, George and Brenda, could see the writing on the wall in June, facing mounting legal pressure and a potential recall petition signed by over 60% of the homeowners. Patricia and her entire board resigned. Emergency elections were held, and a new board was voted in, including Linda, who'd been the only voice of reason in the previous administration. My lawsuit was settled out of court. The HOA agreed to refund all my fines, pay my legal fees, and issue a formal apology. The total came to about $12,000, which barely covered what I'd paid Sam, but it wasn't really about the money. It was about the principle. But the story doesn't end there. In July, I got a call from Tom Richardson. "Derek, you need to hear this. Patricia's been arrested." "What?" "For what?" "Embezzlement." The new board did a full audit of the HOA finances, and they found discrepancies going back 3 years. Patricia and George had been siphoning money from the community funds. I met Tom for coffee that afternoon, and he showed me the police report on his phone. Patricia and George Hendricks had been systematically stealing from the HOA for years. It started small, fake receipts for supplies that were never purchased, inflated bills from vendors that didn't exist. But it had grown to over $70,000. The kicker: some of that money had been used to pay their personal legal fees when fighting my heating bill complaint. They'd literally used stolen HOA funds to dispute a legitimate bill. The Prescott Police Department, working with the Yavapai County Attorney's Office, had been investigating for weeks. They'd found bank records, fake invoices, and even emails between Patricia and George discussing how to hide the missing money. It was thorough, methodical fraud. I was called to testify at the preliminary hearing in August. The courtroom in downtown Prescott was small but packed. Patricia and George both looked diminished, nothing like the authoritative figures they'd presented at HOA meetings. They'd hired a defense attorney, Robert Chen, who seemed to be fighting a losing battle. The prosecutor, a sharp woman named Angela Morrison, presented the evidence methodically. Bank records showing transfers to personal accounts, invoices from fake companies, testimony from legitimate vendors who confirmed they'd never received the payments the HOA records claimed had been made. When it was my turn, Angela asked me about the heating bill incident. "Mr. Brandt, Can you describe your interaction with Mrs. Hendricks regarding the community center heating? I recounted the whole thing, from Patricia's initial visit to the payment of my bill to her subsequent harassment campaign. Angela then presented evidence showing that Patricia had paid her attorney $4,000 in HOA funds to fight my invoice, money that should have gone to community maintenance. And Mr. Brandt, was your invoice ever successfully disputed? No. Their lawyer sent a demand letter, but once I responded with documentation, they dropped it. The system worked exactly as specified in the contract. So the HOA spent $4,000 of community money on a frivolous legal action, money that Mrs. Hendricks authorized without board approval. Objection, Chen said. Speculation about authorization. Sustained, Judge Patricia Thornton said. Angela smiled slightly. Let me rephrase. Mr. Brandt, were you aware that HOA bylaws require board approval for any legal expenditure over $1,000? I am now, yes. And were you contacted by any board member other than Mrs. Hendricks about this legal action? No, just her. The preliminary hearing lasted 2 days. By the end, Judge Thornton found probable cause for multiple counts of embezzlement, fraud, and misuse of community funds. Patricia and George were bound over for trial. The trial itself happened in October. I attended when I could, sitting in the gallery and watching as the case unfolded. The evidence was overwhelming. Beyond the financial records, the prosecution had testimony from Brenda Walsh, who turned state's witness in exchange for immunity. She testified that she'd known about the financial irregularities, but had been too afraid of Patricia to speak up. Brenda's testimony was devastating. She described how Patricia had controlled the board through intimidation and manipulation, how she'd doctored records to hide the missing money, and how she'd used her position to punish anyone who questioned her authority. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours, guilty on all counts. Sentencing came in December, just before Christmas. Patricia was sentenced to 6 years in state prison, though with good behavior she'd probably serve 4. George got 4 years. They were also ordered to pay full restitution to the HOA, which meant selling their house and liquidating their assets. I was in the courtroom for the sentencing. As the bailiffs led Patricia away in handcuffs, she looked at me. There was no anger in her eyes anymore, just defeat and resignation. I felt no satisfaction in seeing her brought low, just a quiet sense that justice had been served. The Whispering Pines HOA has been under new management since then, both in terms of the board and the professional management company we kept on. Summit Community Solutions has been running day-to-day operations, and the difference is night and day. Fines are rare and consistently applied. Communication is clear and professional. The community actually feels like a community now instead of a fiefdom. Linda Martinez became the new HOA president, and one of her first acts was commissioning a proper repair of the community center's heating system. She called me to get a quote. "I understand if you don't want the job," she said. "After everything that happened, I thought about it." "What's your budget?" "We've allocated $8,000 for a complete replacement and installation." "I'll do it for $7,000, and I'll throw in a maintenance package for the first year." "Derek, you don't have to do that. I know, but you're trying to rebuild trust and make things right." "I want to be part of that." I installed a brand new heating and cooling system in the community center that January, working carefully and methodically. It took 2 weeks, but when I was done, that building had climate control that would last 20 years. The new board held a small ceremony when it was completed, thanking me and other homeowners who'd stood up against the corruption. The heating bill that started everything, the $4,100 that Patricia had considered highway robbery, became something of a legend in the neighborhood. People joked about it, calling me the guy who broke the HOA's corrupt board by charging fair market rates. I'd tripled my rate because I didn't want the job, and they'd paid every penny. In the end, that decision to stand firm on my worth had exposed a rot that ran much deeper than anyone had suspected. My HVAC business kept growing. The publicity from the case had actually helped. People in Prescott and surrounding areas knew my name now, and they knew I was someone who stood up for what was right. My calendar stayed full, and I was able to hire 2 employees to help with the increased workload. Tom Richardson and I became good friends. We started a tradition of monthly barbecues where neighbors could gather informally, building the kind of community connections that had been suppressed under Patricia's regime. The Brenner kids' play equipment still stands in their yard, and nobody hassles them about it. Marcus even added a swing set last spring. As for me, I still live in the same house on the same street in Whispering Pines. My work truck still parks in my driveway, and my trash can sit at the curb until I get home from work, and nobody says a word about it. Not because I'm some kind of neighborhood hero, but because we finally have an HOA that understands the difference between maintaining standards and wielding power. Every time I drive past the community center and see the HVAC unit I installed humming away on the side of the building, I think about that cold Tuesday afternoon when Patricia showed up at my door with her clipboard and her attitude. I think about the choice I made to stick to my principles and charge what my time and expertise were worth. It would have been easier to take the job at a discount, to avoid the conflict, to keep my head down. But sometimes the harder path is the right one. Sometimes you have to stand firm, even when it costs you in the short term, because principles matter. Fair payment for fair work matters. Standing up to bullies matters. The heating system works perfectly, by the way. Hasn't had a single issue in the 2 years since installation. I know because Linda sends me a message every few months telling me how well it's running, and how much the community appreciates having a reliable, properly installed system. Last month, the new HOA board voted to give me an appreciation award, a plaque that now hangs in my office that reads, Derek Brandt, for excellence in service and integrity in business. It's a nice gesture, though the real reward has been watching the community heal and grow into what it should have been all along. I learned a lot through this whole experience. I learned that standing up to bullies is hard but necessary. I learned that documentation is your best friend in any dispute. I learned that there are good people everywhere, like Linda and Tom and Sam, who will stand with you when things get tough. And I learned that sometimes charging triple your normal rate isn't highway robbery. It's just good business sense when dealing with difficult clients. The $4,100 I earned from that emergency heating job was probably the most expensive money Patricia and her board ever spent, not because of the amount itself, but because of everything it set in motion. They could have treated me with respect, paid a fair rate, and moved on. Instead, they tried to intimidate and retaliate, and in doing so, they exposed themselves to scrutiny they couldn't withstand. Justice doesn't always come quickly, and it doesn't always come in the form you expect. But in this case, it came thoroughly. Patricia and George are serving their sentences. The HOA has been reformed from the ground up, and Whispering Pines is finally living up to its name as a peaceful, well-managed community. As for me, I'm still fixing heaters and air conditioners, still running my business from my home office, and still parking my work truck in my driveway. The difference is, now I do it without looking over my shoulder for the next petty fine or vindictive board member. My rates are still $300 an hour for emergency work, and I make no apologies for it. Quality work deserves fair compensation, and I've built my reputation on providing both. Some clients balk at the price, and that's fine. But those who pay it get the best service I can provide, backed by 15 years of experience and a commitment to doing things right. The whole situation taught the neighborhood an important lesson too. HOAs are only as good as the people running them and the oversight homeowners provide. For years, people had been passive, letting Patricia and her board do whatever they wanted because it was easier than getting involved. Now, board meetings are well attended. Budget decisions are scrutinized. Homeowners ask questions and demand accountability. That's how it should have always been, but sometimes it takes a crisis to wake people up. Sometimes it takes someone saying no, standing firm, and refusing to be pushed around. I didn't set out to be that person, but when Patricia showed up at my door with her demands and her assumptions, I made a choice. I chose to value my time and expertise. I chose to charge what the work was worth, not what someone who didn't respect me thought it should cost. And when they tried to punish me for it, I chose to fight back with truth and documentation and the law. The system worked, slowly and imperfectly, but it worked. The corrupt board was exposed and removed. The criminals were prosecuted and punished. The community was reformed and strengthened. And I got paid every penny of that $4,100 invoice. Would I do it all again, knowing the stress and conflict it would cause? Absolutely. Because some things are worth fighting for, and self-respect is at the top of that list. Nobody should be bullied or intimidated or forced to work for less than they're worth, whether it's by an HOA board or anyone else. I'm Derek Brandt. I own a small HVAC business in Prescott, Arizona, and I tripled my rate for a difficult client who paid every penny. It was the best business decision I ever made, not because of the money, but because of everything that came after. Sometimes standing up for yourself starts a chain reaction that changes everything. This was one of those times. The sun is setting over Prescott now, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. I'm sitting on my back patio, the same one where I sat 2 years ago when this all started, and the view hasn't changed. But everything else has. The community is better. The people are empowered. And I learned that my worth isn't determined by what someone else wants to pay me, but by what I know I'm worth. That's a lesson that applies far beyond HVAC work and HOA disputes. It's a lesson about standing firm in your convictions, about fighting for what's right, and about not backing down when faced with bullies and intimidation. It's a lesson I'll carry with me for the rest of my life, and one I hope others can learn without having to go through what I did. But if they do have to fight that fight, I hope they remember this story. I hope they remember that sometimes the right choice is the hard choice, and that standing up to corruption and abuse of power is always worth it in the end. The road might be long and difficult, but justice, when it comes, is sweet. And if nothing else, I hope they remember to document everything, hire a good lawyer, and never back down from charging what they're worth.